the story of David in the Old Testament. And we're going to read a portion of his story from 1 Samuel chapter 16, a time that was before his assuming the throne of Israel. In fact, this is when Samuel was told by the Lord to go to the house of Jesse, who was David's father, and to anoint the next king of Israel. Now, Samuel wasn't sure which of the sons of Jesse that it was going to be. And what unfolds here is in some ways even humorous, as God directs Samuel to anoint David as the next king of Israel. So we'll pick it up at 1 Samuel 16, beginning at verse 1. It says, "Now the Lord said to Samuel, how long will you mourn for Saul, who was the current king of Israel, seeing I have rejected him from reigning over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and go. I am sending you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, where I have provided myself a king among his sons." Notice God didn't tell him which one. So Samuel says, "How can I go? If Saul hears it, he will kill me." But the Lord said, "Take a heifer with you and say, I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Then invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show you what you shall do. You shall anoint for me the one I name to you." So Samuel did what the Lord said and went to Bethlehem, and the elders of the town trembled at his coming and said, "Do you come peaceably?" And he said, "Peaceably, I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Sanctify yourselves and come with me to the sacrifice." And then he consecrated Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. So it was, when they came, that he looked at Eliab, this is Jesse's son, his oldest son, and said, "Surely the Lord's anointed is before me." So get the picture. Samuel's come to Jesse's home, his oldest son comes out, and Samuel thinks, surely this is the one. Surely the Lord's anointed is before me. But look what happens. The Lord said to Samuel, "Do not look at his appearance or at his physical stature, because I have refused him." And here's one of the most famous verses in the Old Testament. "For the Lord does not see as man sees. For man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." So Jesse called Abinadab and made him pass before Samuel. And he said, "Neither has the Lord chosen this one." Then Jesse made Shammah pass by. And he said, "Neither has the Lord chosen this one." Thus Jesse made 7 of his sons pass before Samuel. And Samuel said to Jesse, "The Lord has not chosen these." Go on to the next screen. That seemed out of place, that last part. Samuel said to Jesse, "Are all the young men here?" Then he said, "There remains yet the youngest, and there he is keeping the sheep." And Samuel said to Jesse, "Send and bring him, for we will not sit down until he comes here." And so he sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy with bright eyes and good looking. And the Lord said, "Arise, anoint him, for this is the one." And this is David, of course. Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers. And the Spirit of the Lord came upon David from that day forward. So Samuel arose and went to Ramah. 1809 was a very good year. Now, those who lived then may not have known it, but history has told us the story since that time. It was probably such that the eyes of all the world was on the campaigns of Napoleon as he marched his way across Europe, leaving his mark virtually everywhere he went. But during that same time in history, there were some babies that were being born over in Europe and here in the United States. But who cared about babies and bottles and cribs and cradles while Napoleon was on his expedition? But looking back, there was reason to take notice. Just listen to some of the names of the people that were born in the great birth year of 1809. On January the 4th, just 4 days into that year, Louis Braille was born over in France, who himself would be blinded at the age of 3 and later develop a reading system for the blind that's still in use to this day. Just 15 days later, in the city of Boston, Edgar Allan Poe began his brief and tragic sojourn here on earth. Literally just a few miles west of Boston, Oliver Wendell Holmes was born in the city of Cambridge, Massachusetts. Heading back across the Atlantic Ocean to England, Alfred Lord Tennyson, the Victorian-era poet, was born to a minister and his wife. William Gladstone, who would later become the Prime Minister of England, barely squeezed into 1809, having been born on December the 29th in the city of Liverpool. On February the 12th, a physician, Dr. Darwin, and his wife had a son that they named Charles Robert Darwin. And on that very same day, February the 12th, 1809, in a country log cabin in Hardin County, Kentucky, a couple gave birth to a son that they named Abraham Lincoln. But again, who cared about babies other than the families, of course? While Napoleon was about his conquests. And they had no way of knowing it then, but looking back now, the birth of these writers and poets and statesmen and thinkers marked the genesis of an era. You could say that they were nobodies that nobody noticed. Now, if they had had newscasts back in those days, like we do now, maybe somebody could have flipped on the 10 o'clock news and maybe they would have seen something like this. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining us on News Channel 4. In the headlines tonight, the destiny of the world is being shaped on an Austrian battlefield as Napoleon continues his conquest to conquer the world. We turn now to our war correspondent, Don Bateman, who gives us the latest on this cold February evening. Don? No, I'm not going to make Don say anything. It's so tempting, you know. But what we know now, looking back, is that the future was really being shaped in England and in the United States in the arms of young mothers as they held these movers and shakers of the future. It's a strange thing, really, because today only a few history buffs could name even one battle that Napoleon fought while in Austria. But there is not a single one of us here today whose life has not been touched in one way or another by at least one of those individuals I named a while ago that was born in 1809. Nobody's, it seemed, that nobody noticed. Now, if you or I had been alive in 1020 BC, a similar experience may have been ours. On the throne of Israel was a man by the name of Saul, King Saul. He was the focal point. He was the king. You could say that he might have been the Napoleon of his day. While meanwhile, there was this unknown shepherd boy, a young man, probably a teenager, by the name of David, who was tending his father's sheep at Bethlehem. If you had been a neighbor of Jesse, David's father back in those days, there's a pretty good chance that you would not even have known the name of Jesse's youngest son. He was just the shepherd. And yet, God would raise this young man up to be the greatest king of Israel and raise him to such heights that outside of Jesus, imagine this, more is said about David than anyone else in the entire Bible. Which begs the question, doesn't it? Why David? Because there really wasn't anything about David at that time that shouted superstar, king, leader. He was just a shepherd. In fact, David's own father never even considered him to be in the running for the king of Israel. Jesse had 7 of his sons paraded before Samuel. And after the 7th one had gone by, Samuel had to prompt him. He said, well, are these all of your sons? I can almost picture Samuel watching as Jesse kind of rubs his beard, Oh yeah, there is another one. Totally forgot about him. He's out there just watching the flock, David, but certainly he's not the one. Are you kidding me? Samuel says, get him in here. And the Lord told Samuel, this is the one. He's going to be the next king. Makes you wonder, doesn't it? Why did God choose David? I want to tell you something that if you've read the Bible much, then you know this to be a fact. God's choice of an individual is often contrary to human reasoning. Isn't that true? God's choice of an individual to use for his glory is so often contrary to human reasoning. And David was a nobody. He was just a shepherd. And nobody knows David. Wasn't even considered to be a candidate as the next king of Israel. But he was the one God chose. It could be that we have a David among us. Maybe several, maybe many. Maybe you look at yourself and you say, oh, I'm just a nobody. God could never use me. I'm just me. I'm nothing special. I could never teach a Sunday school class. I could never be a preacher or a missionary. I don't even feel confident, being in the music department or serving as an usher or working the vacation Bible school. God could never use me. What can I do? And we look at ourselves and we just don't see ourselves as viable candidates for service in God's kingdom. But I guarantee you, because the scriptures teach this, that God has a place for every one of his children. And I'll tell you something else I believe with all my heart. I believe that God can do more in your life than what you give yourself credit for. I've always believed that God can use us far much more greater than what we think he can, because we doubt ourselves so easily. And you look at the scriptures and you see examples of this all over the holy pages. I mean, you look at Moses. God comes to Moses and wants him to go on this great assignment to deliver the Israelites, and Moses just gives him excuse after. He didn't just stop at one. He just kept going, gives him 5 excuses. He said, oh Lord, I'm slow of speech. And he gives all these excuses, reasons, I can't do this. And of course, God used Moses in such a mighty way that even people that don't go to church know who Moses was. And then you don't read too much further into the scriptures till you come across Gideon, who led the Israelites to victory over the Midianites. And when God came to Gideon, remember what he said? Oh, I'm just from a poor family. We don't have any influence. I can't do this. And God raises up Gideon. In fact, remember, God reduced his army from 32,000 men down to a mere 300. Because God wanted to show that he was mighty and that God could even use someone like Gideon. And God used him. You go further into the Old Testament and you come across Jeremiah. And Jeremiah said, I'm just a youth. And he said, besides that, I'm not a very good communicator. Don't you love how God uses our weaknesses for his glory? Because Jeremiah became a bold communicator of his truth. And all Jeremiah did was write the 3rd longest book in the whole Bible. After Psalms and Isaiah, you got 52 chapters of Jeremiah. Plus he wrote Lamentations. And this was a guy who said, I can't do it, God. How many of God's servants have said, I can't do it? You've got the wrong person. You need to call somebody else. And they've sat back on the sidelines and not done what God has called them to do. Don't be that person. God's calling you, and sometimes you think, oh, I can't do that. I'm just me. My family, my background, things I've done, or I just don't have the talent, not the ability. I'm not smooth enough. I'm not good looking enough, not intelligent enough. I don't have enough influence. God could never use me. That's just the devil talking to you. That's just your own self-doubt talking to you, giving you excuses like Moses had them. And God says, I don't want to hear any of that, because I can use anybody. God can use anybody. He often uses just average Joes like us. There's a principle in this text that I think is so very important. and I mentioned verse 7 just stands out, one of the most famous verses in the Old Testament, certainly in the book of 1 Samuel. And the principle that comes from that verse is this, that external circumstances are not the primary consideration when it comes for service in God's kingdom. Okay? External circumstances are not the primary consideration for use in God's kingdom. You see, that's where we see, as we look out into our world, where the emphasis is. You know, we live in a world that puts a tremendous amount of emphasis on the external, don't we? I mean, all you got to say is, hello, Hollywood, right? I mean, that's all Hollywood is about, are the externals. It's how you look. Or in some circles, it's how much education you have, or how much wealth you have, or how good looking you are, if you've got the white wardrobe going on, and how cool you are, or how much charisma you have. So much of our world just flows and rotates around all the externals. And so it's easy to come to believe that we have to have certain external characteristics or certain abilities in order for God to use us. We either have to feel like we have to have the right wardrobe, or we have to have that right Hollywood look, with no blemishes and all the hair in the right place, or we feel like we have to have a certain amount of money in the bank, or live in a certain house, or have had a certain score on our ACT, or a certain level of education, or be able to speak well and communicate well, or have a certain characteristic of charisma, or something of that nature, and we start thinking that this is what it takes to have success in God's kingdom. And God says, as quote my father, that's hogwash. That's just a bunch of baloney. That's what the world teaches and preaches. But God says no. I mean, think about this. This is so ingrained in us that even the prophet Samuel fell into this trap. And Samuel was a man of God. He's one of the most respected biblical characters that we have. The Bible speaks of him in glowing terms. And he comes to anoint the next king of Israel. God hasn't said who it's going to be, but Jesse brings Eliab, the oldest son, out, and the first thought that Samuel has. Now, he didn't say it, I don't think, but he thought it. He took a look at Eliab, and he thought, surely the Lord's anointed is before me. He just took a look at Eliab and thought, this is the one. He must have been tall, probably a good-looking fella, maybe muscular. Thought, man, he'd make a good king. This has got to be the one. He maybe had a good walk about him with confidence. And Samuel fell into this trap. And so God had to stop him. And he said, not so fast now, Samuel. He said, because God doesn't see as man sees. See, man looks on the outward appearance, but God looks upon the heart. We find out later that Eliab was petty, negative, critical. He looked down on his brothers, and he failed to recognize the providence of God. And that was the one that impressed Samuel. Isn't that interesting? That's the one that Samuel thought. You see, even people of God can fall into this. This is great news for the people of God. Because, I wasn't born with Hollywood looks, so I'm thinking don't have to worry about that. Maybe you're thinking, well, I don't look like Brad Pitt or Angelina Jolie. You can tell I'm older because I pick the older celebrities. These are the ones I grew up with. You don't have to look like them, or you don't have to be as famous as Kim Kardashian and Kanye West to have a type of influence. You don't have to be as smart or intelligent as Stephen Hawking. You don't have to have all of that going for you. God says all those things are just external. Those are things the world looks for. And this is really good news. Because, let's be honest, only a small percentage of people have the Hollywood looks, or the brilliant mind, or the billionaire bank accounts, or CEOs of companies, or what have you. So that leaves the rest of us, doesn't it? What if God said, well, I'm only taking those elite? That's not how God works. In fact, God often uses people who lack in education or wealth or good looks, because sometimes people who have all that stuff rely more on themselves than they do on God. And God says, I want to prove that it's me getting the glory. That's why you go to ministers' meeting and you find so many ugly people. You know? I'm just kidding. I'm saying that because I'm putting myself in that category. That's why I pick on preachers, you know. But you see, God just uses average folk, like all of us. And that's good news. Let's go back 40 years. Because there's not a hole there that I dug for myself there. When King Saul was about to be anointed king. And remember when the people chose the king? They wanted a king. They told Samuel, we want a king, we want to select our king. And Samuel, Samuel said it's probably not a good idea, but that's what the people wanted. They persisted. And you remember who they chose, of course, was Saul. Why did they choose Saul? Do you remember? The Bible says he was tall. He was strong. He looked like a king. And they were kind of like, if we have Saul, man, he will represent our country well because he looks like a king. We find out later that Saul is hot-tempered, thin-skinned, given to murder, and died of suicide. That was the people's choice. Think about it. That's how people choose kings. That's why God had to intervene with Samuel and say, don't go with just what you're looking at. God says, I look at the heart. As we look at ourselves, I think one of the things that hinders us as children of God is that we often doubt ourselves. I mentioned that earlier, right? We sometimes, I just can't do this and I can't do that. And sometimes, we may not be very good at something when we're starting out, but you got to work on it. I tell you what, just because you're not good at something, that doesn't mean you ought to quit. I mean, just look at the Nebraska football team, okay? You know what I'm saying? So, that means you need to give up, but keep pursuing. In fact, you may have heard these facts from history, but Beethoven was once told that as a composer, he was hopeless. Alexander Graham Bell was told by his teachers he was too stupid to learn. Walt Disney was once fired as a newspaper editor because they said he had no good ideas. Think about that. And you may be thinking, well, I'm not very good at this, or maybe you're just starting out at something, so I'm really rough around the edges. That's okay. God will smooth those out. And God can use you. But I'll tell you something that I truly believe, that I've learned from personal experience and observation. We tend to overestimate the ability of other people and underestimate our own. And so what happens is we look at other people who are ahead of us, maybe in a particular career or something we'd like to do, or maybe in service in the church. And we almost picture them as being almost perfect, like, oh, they got it all together. They have all this confidence and all this belief in themselves. And then you look at yourself and you realize all the self-doubt that you have and the insecurities that you have. And you know what the reality is? The person that you're admiring probably had, or maybe still has, that same self-doubt, that same questions about themselves. They've just found a way to work through it. You don't know about that because they don't advertise it. But you know about your own because you deal with it every day. And so what happens then is that we look at other people and we see they just seem to have it all perfectly together. And then we look at ourselves and say, man, I just don't think I can do this. And I wasn't going to tell this story, but I just feel led to. I was telling Sister Lynette about it the other day because it's about Steve Carney. And Steve Carney preached here, what was it, 2 weeks ago? 2 weeks ago. And he told this publicly, so I don't think he'll mind me telling it. But he was doing, I remember the first time I saw Steve Carney, and how many of you all were here when he preached a couple weeks ago? Remember? He's a good preacher, great pastor. He was at retirement age and just enjoying a new time of life. And I remember the first time I walked into a minister's meeting, he was preaching, and I thought, man, this guy, he really brought it, great power, great message. And, after that, it was probably 10 years ago, maybe 12 years ago. And so, I kind of got a little acquainted with him. I found out later that he graduated from Talmadge High School, which is where I was pastoring at the time. So we don't really know him real well, but got a little connected with him. Well, a couple of years later, he was teaching at a minister's meeting, kind of like a seminar type thing. And he told this experience he had. When he was young, probably in his 20s, I would guess, he was pastoring in a town up by Lake Erie called Elyria. And I was familiar with that church a little bit. I'd been up that way a few times. And he said that the church started growing and growing and, kind of getting to the point where they were outgrowing their building. And what he said next just blew me away. He said, I didn't know what to do next, so I left and went to another church. And that really hit me in a good way. Let me say why. Because, I looked at Steve Carney, and I thought, man, this guy's got it all together. He's smooth in the pulpit. He's got all this confidence and everything. He's been a minister for a long time, all this experience. But what that said to me was, you know what? He's just a human being like I am. And I appreciated his candor, his honesty. Because sometimes, we look at these people who have gone before us and we think, man, they just got it all together. They're just smooth, And yet he had the same insecurities that someone like me might have, And it made me identify with him. And I thought, you know what? Sometimes these big shots we talk about, we think, man, they're just on another level. They're human too. And we've got to quit overestimating everybody else's ability. I could never attain that. Because what happens is we kind of cower in their shadow and say, I could never become anything. Because we notice all of our insecurities and all of our doubts. And we just got to work through those. And believe that God can use us. Let me mention a couple of things David had in his life that enabled God to use him in a great way. One thing that he did was he was faithful in little things. Remember when he got ready to face Goliath? And he was going before Saul and said, I can do this. And Saul was like, are you crazy? He didn't even want to wear the armor. Remember, David didn't. And he's talked about how the bears and the lions had tried to overtake his flock, and David had fended them off, And he said, the God who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of this bear will give me victory over this Philistine, and he will be as one of those. You see, David had proven himself faithful as a shepherd, so God was going to use him for great things. David had been faithful in taking food and such to the army. He'd been helping in that in whatever way he could. And so God used him for great things. A lot of times, why I say that is this. A lot of times we think, well, when I get a certain title, or when I get a certain position in the church, or when I get into this one particular ministry, well, then I'll get serious about God. Or when I become a Sunday school teacher, then I'll become studious and start reading the Bible more and studying theology and doctrine. When I get to a certain point that, no. That's not how it works. That's not how it works. If you're not doing those things now, God's not going to raise you to a new level. You've got to be faithful where you are. You can't say, well, I'm going to wait until I get a certain position, a certain title, a certain area of influence, and then I'll get serious about my life. You know what? You'll never get to those places because God's not going to give them to you. Because in Luke 16:10, Jesus said, he that is faithful in that which is little will be faithful in that which is much. So if you're not faithful in that which is little, you're never going to have a place of great influence because God's not going to entrust it to you. It's kind of like this. If you don't know how to balance your checkbook, I'm not going to hire you to be my accountant. See what I'm saying? You got to be able to do the little things. And if you can't do the little things, God's not going to give you bigger things. And one thing that I admire about David is how faithful he was before he ever knew that he was going to be a king. He was faithful in the little things. And so you got to bloom where you're planted and see what doors God may open. And then the other thing about David is how humble he was. In Psalms, he's described as a servant. And David was very, very humble as he came before the Lord here after he found out he was going to be king. What would you do if God told you said you were going to be the next president or the next governor or whatever? What would you do? What did David do? Did he go to the mall and buy himself a new crown? Or did he get his business card changed from saying shepherd to king? Did he get a badge that says, I'm going to be the next king of Israel? Of course not. In fact, if you read the few verses after what we read this morning, it says that an evil spirit had come upon Saul, and so he asked his servants to bring somebody that could soothe his anxiety with music and such, and of course you know who they got, right? David. David could have said, I ain't going to do that. You know who I am? I'm going to be the next king of Israel. No, he didn't take that attitude. He said, okay, however they need me, I'll be faithful. And he was very humble in his service, in his ministry. And so God wants us to. God's not going to use proud people. He's not going to use egotistical people. He's not going to want to use people that just in it for the title or just in it to be lifted up. He uses humble people who've proven themselves faithful, as David did. We go back to 1809, and again, we find everybody focused on what's happening in Europe as Napoleon was conquering, invading, or conquering new lands. And in that same time, all these little babies came into the world that were going to shape the future. Today it's 2018, and in the news is North Korea, always the Middle East, Washington, D.C., all these different locations around the world. But it could be that right here in Sapulpa, Oklahoma, God is raising up a young man or a young woman in his service, in his kingdom, maybe a not-so-young man or a not-so-young woman, or a new emphasis in their life. And God's calling a new place for you. I'm not saying a new location, a new city. I'm thinking just maybe a new area of influence. Maybe God's calling you to try something that you've never tried before because you always thought, I could never do it. Who am I? Anyway, I'm just little old me. God loves using little old me's to do great things for his kingdom. You just got to believe. You got to trust that God can take that little seed in your life and enable it to bloom, to do things that you never dreamed. I truly believe with all my heart that we're capable of doing far more than what we think we can. Not because we're so great, but because God's so great. I want to tell you this one more story. Another one I didn't really plan on telling, but Robin Wood has been a pastor in the Church of God for a long time. You know Robin Wood? And when he was in school, he said that he was just terrible in English. Just terrible in English. He struggled to get through grammar and all these different things. It's just, that was his, for me it's science, for him it was English. And then God called him to be a preacher. And he's a very good, dynamic speaker. And one time, years later, he saw one of his professors, English professors, and asked him what he was doing. And Robin Wood said, I'm a pastor, I didn't know he was a pastor. And he said, you're a preacher. And he kind of started laughing. And Robin Wood, asked him why he laughed. And he says, because it just amazes me that you're making a living using English skills that you don't have. And it's just a great example of 1 Samuel 16:7. Some English person might have looked at Robin Wood and said, you ain't got it, son. You don't even know what a noun and a verb and adjectives and adverbs are. You expect to be able to communicate well? And yet God has used his life to do many great things. Don't doubt what God can do. Believe him. Let's stand together as we pray. Lord Jesus, we are so thankful for you.